welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Got the whole crew with us, Kipp Adams and Ben Wolk, on this Monday afternoon. Recording a little bit earlier in the week than we usually do, but for good reason, because there was a lot of news out of this weekend. And at the top of what we'll talk about is Georgia punching its ticket back to Atlanta to play in the SEC title game for the fourth straight year. We're going to go in depth about that, the college football playoff implications of a wild Week 13 in college football, talk Georgia Tech getting ready for clean old-fashioned hate, 7:30 p.m. on ABC Friday night. Talk a lot of recruiting news, and also talk about UGA Hoops getting a win over a top 25 opponent. But fellas, let's start with honestly why we are talking on Monday instead of our regular Tuesday, and it's because of what went down in the SEC on Saturday. Kipp and I had the episode on Thursday where we talked about, hey, Georgia still got a path to the SEC title game. Their chances of going to Atlanta maybe slim, but not totally eliminated. And then even on Saturday, it was wild how the day started. We knew Georgia had a chance, and then you ride this thing out over the course of the day. Ole Miss loses at Florida. Alabama loses at Oklahoma. Texas A&M loses in 4 overtimes at Auburn. And then 11:55 p.m. Eastern time, the SEC puts out the message on social media, hey, quit trying to figure out the tiebreakers, guys. Georgia is going to Atlanta. I want to start with you, Kipp. What did you think of just how wild this thing played out, especially on Saturday, and the fact that Georgia's getting ready to play for the SEC championship game and have a chance to bring home the conference title?
How many incorrect text scenarios did I send you guys that night? I mean, if you want to talk about a night to forget for me, I was going through every single scenario. Thought for sure, I'm like, guys, this is exactly it. And then like 2 texts later, wait, no. And then we were crashing that guy's site. Now, I mean, good for him. The site revenue that the person who created that, the SEC scenario calculator that we talked about in the last show, probably got, Dawgs 247 level traffic. I mean, I'm sure almost every user on the site was using it as well as us, trying to figure everything out. And that's just how wild of a night it was. I knew, once Ole Miss, once Ole Miss lost to Florida, that definitely started, getting the ball rolling with, wait a second, this is a bigger domino than maybe we thought. And then, once Alabama lost, it was like, okay, what scenario exists to where Georgia does not get in the SEC championship game? We kept trying to figure out opponents' winning percentage, the common opponents, going through all the tiebreakers. It was pure chaos, pure madness in the group chat. And, not one of my best nights as far as, trying to figure out how the internet works. But you know what? Kudos to the SEC for creating this madness and creating a setup to where we have to use this guy's, no offense, but GeoCities looking website to figure out who's going to play in the SEC championship game instead of just the SEC actually providing that info on their own website. That would have been the most helpful. But hey, you know what? It was fun. It was entertaining. And we went from thinking about, this team might, value the rest to, all right, they're playing an SEC championship game. Good thing we put in for credentials.
Yeah, I'm glad we got that taken care of. And Kipp, you were not alone. I was trying to figure out the tiebreakers. The site kept crashing. I really think this site crashing on me threw me into a panic to where I just was like, I didn't want to say for sure they were in. I even posted on the Junkyard saying, I don't know for a fact that they have clinched, but they're in a really good spot. I tweeted about it, and people were like, you idiot, they're in. And I'm like, I'm not saying anything until I see someone who knows, and it ain't me, that they are for sure in. But Georgia gets in, obviously. I understand where folks are kind of torn on, is this good for Georgia? But I think you welcome it. You understand what's at stake. And you get a chance to go back to Atlanta, which I know we're not going to complain about. It's always a fun place to follow a game. Ben, what was Saturday night like for you trying to follow this mess? And then your thoughts on Georgia going back to the SEC title game?
Well, obviously, I knew from the beginning Georgia was going to be in the SEC championship game, right? Like, I knew no matter what scenarios played out, I knew, of course, Georgia was going to be there, right? I could not believe, one, that Georgia qualified for the SEC championship game, having lost 2 games to Ole Miss and Alabama. Just thinking about the fact that both of those teams would have had to lose 3 SEC games seemed unimaginable. The fact that they not only qualified for the SEC championship game, but they were the first team in the conference to qualify for the SEC championship game, and they did it this past weekend instead of the last weekend of the year. It's crazy. I cannot believe that we woke up on Saturday and I did not think in any world that there was a scenario that would play out for Georgia to be in the SEC championship game when that night ended. And I think that just goes to show how fun college football is. You know, if I remember correctly, on the post-game podcast, we didn't know what was going to happen in the Alabama-Oklahoma game yet, obviously. We were talking a little bit about Ole Miss, Florida, and just some of the chaos that happens around college football and just how we spent a lot of time and energy the last couple of weeks talking about the rankings as if we knew exactly how the rest of the year was going to play out. And I think that Alabama going to Oklahoma and putting up 3 points is the best indicator in the world that we can never make these types of assumptions. And, you know, I think that that's what makes college football great. I think that that was one of the best college football Saturdays in a long time, but there have been a lot of those this year because there has been some true chaos in college football this season. And so super fun Saturday. I think for anybody that's not an Alabama or Ole Miss or Texas A&M fan, I think that everybody thoroughly enjoyed that night and how everything played out. And, I don't care what anybody says, Jordan, you want to be in the SEC championship game. I wanted so badly to not have to like go on any kind of rant or give any hot take about my thoughts on the SEC championship game. But one of my biggest pet peeves was hearing people time and time again say, you don't want to be in the SEC championship game. And Kipp, Jordan, I'm sorry if you had that opinion, but I just need to get this off my chest because to me, one, the SEC championship game has to matter, right? Like right now, like you have to care about winning the conference. The SEC sits around and everybody pats themselves on the back for how hard the schedule is and how difficult it is to live life in the SEC. Like you go have a championship game. Like what are we doing here? Go have a championship game. I understand the sentiment that people are concerned about being punished by the committee for losing a game. And I just truly do not believe that that's something that's going to happen. I think that if you lose the SEC championship game, you will be viewed as a 10-2 non-champion. And everyone will say, well, last year, you know, if Georgia loses and they're out. And it's like, yeah, they were out and they were 6 behind 5 conference champions. So it's just the way that it has been in the past. I understand how it's been in the past. I understand what happened last year. That's not what's going to happen this year. They're not going to put a 10-2 non-champion Georgia behind a 10-2 non-champion Tennessee that they beat by 14 points. And Tennessee's probably looking at a home playoff game right now. So I don't want to hear you can go and lose and fall out of the playoff and it's terrible for seeding. That's nonsense. Now, if you go to the SEC championship game and lose, yes, you do have an extra game and then you have to go win 4 in a row, which is a bad place to be. I'm not denying that. But in my opinion, the importance of that first round bye and only having to beat 3 of those playoff caliber teams has been one of the most like egregious things that has not been talked about all year long when everybody's been bringing this up. Because I mean, Georgia has won 4 games in a row one time this year. They've won 3 games in a row on 3 separate occasions. We're talking about a very different caliber of team that you're having to beat 3 times in a row or 4 times in a row in December. And yeah, do you want the rest in the SEC, like the SEC championship week? Do you want a little bit of rest? Yes. You know when you really want rest? The week before you're having to play 3 weeks in a row against 3 of the best teams in college football. And so, yes, you want to be in this game. You want to go win the SEC championship game. You want to, beyond all odds, prove that you're the best team in the best conference. And so I had to get that off my chest. And I'm sorry. You guys didn't ask for that, but I had to do that.
Do you feel better?
I do. I feel so much better.
I'm with you, Ben. Really, the only case where I would say, okay, you don't want to play in the SEC title game is just the health of this team. And this has sort of been my conversation in the last few weeks, especially when it's like, well, Georgia may not play in this. It's like, well, that might be better. Trevor Etienne, who knows if he'd be able to play if they played in Atlanta. Dylan Bell's hurt now, trying to get back. You know, the other running backs, Branson Robinson, Roderick Robinson. That's the biggest case to me as far as not wanting to play in Atlanta. But to me, you want to go there. You've got that opportunity to win that game. And we're still waiting to see who Georgia's going to play. Texas or Texas A&M. We've already seen Georgia can beat Texas. You can't guarantee they're going to beat them twice. They always say it's hard to beat the same team twice, but we know that they can handle and hang with Texas, and I feel pretty good about Georgia's chances if it were Texas A&M. So you like that opportunity to go earn that bye. But I also look at this too, guys, from the standpoint of the fans. And I go back to Georgia's first national championship when they beat Alabama. That was such a big deal that it was Alabama, because let's say Georgia had played Michigan, had played whoever else and won that title. Everybody was said, that's great. Still couldn't beat Alabama. If it was this year, if Georgia circumvented the SEC title game, doesn't play in it, let's say Georgia wins the title. Okay, you won it, but man, you got lucky you didn't have to go to Atlanta, because who knows how that would have played out. At least you're going to have your own destiny in your hands, and you're going the toughest route. And I know that that's not ideal. And again, my biggest concern is the injury proponent of this, just trying to get healthy. But again, you have a team that is capable of going to Atlanta, winning, earning that bye. So go take care of business, beat a playoff caliber team in Mercedes-Benz Stadium, and then get ready for the playoff.
I like that thought process, but it's still a fool me once situation, which is what I'm saying to Ben's point. Georgia should want to be in this game because there is a value in earning a first-round bye and having an SEC championship. And like Jordan and I discussed, it's on the College Football Playoff Committee to not have made conference championships more valuable than they seem to be right now. Moving forward, again, I reiterate, Greg Sankey needs to go in there and say both my participants need to be locked into a playoff moving forward. And the fact that we have to sit here and say, we hope the committee doesn't do what they did last year, which was penalize the loser of this conference championship, shows you that there is an issue with how the playoff system is built right now. You want Georgia or whoever loses this game to be seen as a non-conference championship winner with the record they had before, but we just saw them not do that last year. So it's up to the committee to make sure no one's penalized. For Georgia, I mean, there should be only upside to playing in this game. You get a chance to win a conference championship and get a first-round bye. Two good things for your program. You lose the game, you should be in the exact same situation you were before. But that's not up to Georgia. That's up to them. For Georgia fans, yeah, you get bragging rights. You're playing Texas, the chance to go 2-0 against them and say that wasn't a fluke. We beat you on the road and in a neutral site. The chance to play Texas A&M again and say, or we still haven't played you in your own place, but we've played you in two other places, beat you there. Maybe one day we'll get to play you in College Station. I don't know when that'll be. It's been 12 years. That's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, Georgia should be excited about playing in this game. The fact that they might be able to be penalized for losing the game, one, it's a loser mentality. Second, again, that's another problem for another conversation for another day with the committee. For whoever loses that game, they should have the exact same ranking, but they haven't shown they're willing to do that until they actually do it. I don't trust them until they prove it to me. This is their opportunity to do that. Whoever loses this game should just have pretty similar seating to what they had before. You should be moving teams up that are not playing in a conference championship weekend. They're doing nothing to help their resume. They're the exact same team they were a week before. Let's make this happen, guys. Prove me wrong and impress everyone. That's all I'm asking.
Well, let's talk about the college football playoff ranking. We're recording this on Monday. It will come out on Tuesday night. There's going to be a flurry of changes because of this weekend's results. And I'm going to go through, this is how the bracket was set up. This is not these teams' rankings. But from last week's bracket, the team that was seeded 7th, Indiana, lost. You had the team that was seeded 9th, Alabama, lost. You also had Ole Miss, the 10th seed, in this bracket, lose. So Georgia's got a real opportunity to move up. In that last bracket, they were projected to play at Penn State, who got a big scare. If you remember, Kip, I think I pointed to Penn State, Minnesota to watch that game, and Minnesota gave Penn State all it could handle. But I think this is a big opportunity for Georgia in this next set of rankings. Kip, what do you expect to see as far as how high up Georgia could move in this latest ranking? What you think might be fair coming out of this wild week of college football?
I think it should match both the polls. I think Georgia should be 6th. Again, the other thing we said was Indiana, if you don't win this game, then you have nothing on your resume that makes me think you're worthy of a top 10 college football playoff ranking, if anything, even being in the college football playoff. It's not just a wins and losses scenario. I mean, you look at the top 25 wins, top 10 wins, and no other program other than, Ohio State really comes close to what Georgia has on its schedule. So you look at Oregon at the top, again, good, perfect combination. You look at Ohio State next, and then after that, you're kind of arguing different things. And so I just think for Georgia, they need to move to the top, definitely the top of the 2-loss teams, but they should be ahead of some of these 1-loss teams as well. You have to reward them for the schedule that they have played this year.
I think the team I'm going to be watching closely, and Kip, you were kind of hitting on this, is where Indiana is in relation to Georgia. Because I've talked about this, and even on some radio hits last week, I am not someone that's like, get Indiana the hell out of here. Like, I think it's a great story. I mean, they've done a fantastic job, but they had their opportunity to prove they were really a legitimate top tier playoff team against Ohio State, and they didn't do it. And, that's nothing to be like ashamed of. And I don't think it's a reason to say, well, they never belonged in the first place. No, it's more of that was a very important measuring, stick, a test, and you failed it. Georgia needs to be ahead of Indiana in the upcoming bracket. Now, I'm not opposed to Indiana still being in this 12-team field, but they have no business. They have no wins that you would say, okay, they've proven themselves here. Michigan State? A Michigan State team that I don't think to date is bowl eligible, or if they are, they got like 6 wins. That's sort of the measuring stick. That's the comparison I'm going to be paying attention to Tuesday night. Where does Indiana come in relation to Georgia? Because it's no contest. Georgia should be ahead of them. Ben, what do you think as far as the playoff picture, what you think should happen, and if you have thoughts on what you think will happen when the latest ranking comes out?
Well, I think they'll probably stay status outside of Indiana. I think they'll stay status quo with the top 6. I think they'll just shift everybody up. And so I think that Georgia, for me, the conversation with Georgia right now is where do them, and I would say Tennessee. I think that Georgia and Tennessee should probably just be on the same side of Indiana and Miami, whichever the other one was. It was like my complaint last week that Alabama was a spot ahead of Miami, but all the other 3 2-loss SEC teams were behind Miami, which made no sense to me because they'd all played each other and beat each other and lost to each other. And yet they were saying that Alabama was clearly, from an eye test perspective, I guess, better than Miami, so they could put them ahead, but nobody else was, which I think that was debunked pretty quickly in Norman, Oklahoma on Saturday night. So I'm interested to see what they do with Georgia in relationship to Miami and to Indiana. Same goes for Tennessee. I personally would put them ahead of both of those teams, but I can understand the case for the other side of that. I think I'm going to be watching what I think a lot of people are probably going to be watching with this is where Alabama is in this thing, because I know what happened. Everybody saw Alabama lose, say, oh, they're going to go 9-3. And now they got to still go play Auburn and win, which is not a gimme necessarily, but 9-3 Alabama, you would think that they're probably going to be ranked ahead of South Carolina because they have that head-to-head win against South Carolina, even though, common opponent stuff and things like that. Like, I think that they're pretty even. How the committee has treated Alabama traditionally, I just talked about them giving what I felt was Alabama favoritism over Miami last week compared to the other SEC teams. I think that Alabama will be ahead of South Carolina, and I think South Carolina is inching its way up into this as well. I think that South Carolina-Clemson game on Saturday is sneakily becoming, I don't want to say a play-in game, But I think that game, it gets very interesting with how the committee views the winner of that game, depending on how that one goes down. And so I'll be watching where they have Alabama, because I know anybody that's outside of the SEC, they get real annoyed with quote unquote SEC bias, which I would push back on and say, I think that there's one SEC program that tends to get significant committee favoritism, and I wouldn't say that it necessarily extends to the entire conference. I'm interested to see where Alabama falls in this one.
It's going to be fascinating, and I would encourage folks to stay glued to Dawgs 24/7 Tuesday night. Kipp will have you covered on the latest playoff ranking, and we'll get ready for what I'm sure will be a very calm, a very by-the-book into the regular season and the postseason, and that it will go exactly as we all anticipate.
I'll also say, I know I'm going to get ripped and called a homer for that, about that line, that little snide remark that I just made about Alabama committee favoritism, but I mean, I think we can just call it what it is. They've sort of gotten advantages that other teams haven't necessarily gotten.
I'd 100% agree with you. So if they want to come after you, they're coming after me too, Ben. And I won't let that happen. We're going to take a quick break, come back and talk about clean old-fashioned hate. Georgia and Georgia Tech getting ready for a Friday night matchup. Talk about what Kirby Smart and the players had to say about Georgia Tech. Also talk some recruiting news, and also talk about Georgia basketball. All right, guys, we're getting ready for a little Black Friday edition of Clean Old Fashioned Hate. And before we get into that, I want to get y'all's thoughts. How are we feeling about this game being played on Friday? I'll speak for myself. I don't hate it with the slate we're getting on Saturday. We're going to get to watch Texas A&M, get to see if something weird happens in the Iron Bowl. I kind of like getting this thing going on Black Friday. Ben, you got any thoughts?
I do love it. I know Kirby mentioned this today during his press conference. It's a shame because they had originally planned for the high school state playoffs to not be happening this weekend, but hurricane and I think the biolab fire caused some postponements throughout the year that resulted in this weekend ending up having to be used for the state playoffs. So some recruits that probably aren't going to be able to be at the game that they would have liked to be able to be at the game. And also, I'm going to be at the Georgia game instead of a high school football game on a Friday night, which I'm not going to be complaining because this is a good one. This is a fun one. But I like my high school Friday nights as well. But I think it's fun just because it's different. I think we talked about this since the beginning of the year. Like, this game has lacked some juice over the last decade. And I think Brent Key has certainly injected some juice back into this rivalry. And I think that having it on a Friday night like this in Sanford Stadium, night game, it's going to be, I don't know, I'm sure there's some other games going on, but close to a standalone game on TV. It's going to just create some fun exposure, different experience than most of us have been able to have with the Georgia football game. And so for that reason, I think it's fun, cool, and different. I will go as far as to say, if there were ever a game for Kirby to sneakily pull out the black jerseys, this is the one. I'm not saying they're doing it. I'm just saying this is the one. If anybody in Buttsmere equipment team hears this, do whatever you got to do to move it up the chain. This is the one.
100% agree that there's just no excuse. It's been too long. They need to break them out. And hey, fingers crossed for us working. Maybe Claude Felton will bring us some Thanksgiving leftovers, coming right after Thanksgiving. I'm hoping maybe they'll treat us right there in the press box. Kipp, what do you think about this situation? On a serious note, Kirby talked about on Monday that they talked about this game, playing it on Friday night provides a little bit more exposure to it. For me, I'm a fan of it. What do you think about it being played on Friday night?
This is a clear win for the fans because we just saw Georgia's best atmosphere of the season by far. And you're going to get an opportunity to have that exact same production, the lights, the fireworks again. You're probably not getting a 7:30 kickoff on Saturday with the slate that they have, with Texas Tech A&M, Auburn, Alabama, even heck, the Tennessee Vandy game. Yeah, you would be competing with other teams for those kickoff times. and you may have lost that battle with a couple of those. So I just think, again, getting a night game, yes, day earlier, you gotta break out of the Thanksgiving coma and prepare to have your game day experience a day earlier. But it's also going to make for a more enjoyable Saturday, assuming Georgia wins. But for the fan base, you're going to get to watch pure havoc, college football playoff havoc on Saturday with some of the games I just mentioned, plus Notre Dame, USC, that Miami Syracuse game, and South Carolina Clemson. That's another big time game that could have some ramifications. So I think that Kirby was right. This is how you get this game front and center. This is how you make this a primetime matchup. I mean, the game had grown stale. I think Brent Key's done it. The job became kind of a second to third tier job. The budget for Georgia Tech, they weren't competing for elite recruits. Now they've become a lot more competitive. The series might not, we don't know how competitive the series is going to get. Georgia's had a pretty good run. But this helps both programs, in my opinion. It's going to help Georgia Tech become more competitive, and it's going to help Georgia just, again, primetime games help the program, no matter, if it's Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. So I just think this was a win-win. They do have to get up for this game earlier, but so does Georgia Tech. And then as soon as this game's over with, it's a benefit. You get to prepare for that SC championship.
Yeah, you get an extra day to do that, and I'm sure that Georgia's coaching staff will be glued to Texas A&M and seeing how that thing plays out. Again, Friday night, 7:30 Eastern time on ABC, Georgia Tech. A lot of conversation the last few days about this matchup. First, I want to load up a clip of Kirby Smart after the win over UMass. We just asked about this rivalry. That's what Kirby had to say.
We have kids from all over, right? They have kids from all over, and if you don't grow up in this state, sometimes you don't acknowledge and recognize that, right? I think our players, our current players, understand it. If you've been in our program for 4 years, you definitely understand it. But 50% of our team is either a freshman or new from a portal, and they didn't know. They weren't part of it. They haven't been part of it. So it's something that's important. It's instilled early in your career here. I mean, we got lots of rivalries. This is one of the big.
Yeah, this is going to be one that Georgia desperately wants because it's the next one. But you think about Georgia's dominance in this series. Georgia's going for its 8th straight. Think about this, guys, and especially think about it in how competitive some of these teams have been. If Georgia wins this one on Saturday for the senior class, that means going undefeated against Georgia Tech, going undefeated against Florida, going undefeated against Tennessee, going undefeated against Auburn. I mean, that just even like I'm imagining going back and telling 10-year-old Jordan that, having watched those wars back in the early 2000s. I mean, Kipp, this is a huge opportunity. And I think that, Kirby traditionally has done a very good job of getting what these games mean across to guys. But I think this is a big one. And that they understand Georgia Tech would love nothing more than to ruin Georgia's playoff hopes.
And coming off the performance they just had, especially defensively, that Kirby Smart's telling them just that. Like, guys, stop thinking about Atlanta right now. We have to come out there and play Georgia football, or this is going to be a 4-quarter battle that, is a losable game. And I just think that, again, like we talked about games in Jacksonville, I don't think Kirby Smart's ever going to not have this team ready for this matchup. He knows it means too much to him, and he knows it means just as much to Brent Key on the other side. I mean, you have a former Georgia Tech player living out the same dream that Kirby's living in Athens right now, so he knows that team is going to be up for this matchup. And yeah, every team that plays Georgia, it's often their Super Bowl. But I just think that the meaning of this game, the intensity of this game, it's going to be revved up. And I do think both teams are going to be extremely focused on, again, an underrated rivalry in college football that I think is going to be improved by playing, a night game, whether it's Friday, Saturday, whatever day. I think under the lights, this matchup is going to be, rejuvenated for both fan bases.
Ben, I'm going to kind of change the question for you and get your thoughts. Looking at this game, I think Georgia's going to win it, but I sort of get the sense If we're talking about an upset, this sets up fairly well because it's a short week. And I wrote about this on Monday. Arian Smith talked after the UMass game about, we're not an ACC team, so we're not used to having to play on Thursday, Friday nights. The ACC this year did a very good job in its scheduling to ensure that those teams that had those Thursday, Friday games, about 3/4 of them had a bye week before. So there's not even that many ACC teams that have had to have these quick turnarounds. Kirby talked about it on Monday, saying that, they have talked to teams that have had to do this in the past. I don't know. I think Georgia's got a pretty good shot, but the fact it sets up on a Friday night, it makes me kind of wonder how this thing's going to play out.
Well, I agree, especially from a just time to prepare standpoint for them. I think it helps that they played UMass last week, and I don't want to point any fingers or suggest anything that Kirby Smart would never admit, but I would imagine they were probably doing a little look ahead to Georgia Tech last week, UMass week, just given how some of the events defensively went in that one against UMass. Just my 2 cents or thoughts without any knowledge. I think that Georgia Tech this is a team that beat Miami. This is the only team in college football that beat Miami. Miami's the number 1 scoring offense in college football. They're averaging 46 points a game, and they gave up 23 to them. So they halved Miami's season average in a win at Georgia Tech. I will say Georgia Tech was undefeated at home this season, so they had a lot. They performed very well at home. Georgia has, won 30 in a row at home. And I think that home environment is going to make it very difficult for Georgia Tech to do what it wants to do offensively in this one. I think that Georgia, to what Kirby Smart said after the game, he thinks it was probably good for them to get that wake-up call. I think that is going to show up in this one as well. So Georgia's a 20.5-point favorite for a reason. There are some things about Georgia Tech that I think create a little bit of a scare factor. And if you let things get uncomfortable early, they can really start rolling the ball on the ground. So I think that you got to be careful there. But we just watched Georgia score 59 points. When this offense is not turning the ball over, this offense can do pretty much what it wants to do, no matter what anybody said about Mike Bobo and Carson Beck. And I think that that's going to continue on Saturday. So I would expect for Georgia to be flirting with the spread in this one. And again, if Georgia hadn't, from a health standpoint and time to recover standpoint, if Georgia hadn't messed around as much as it did defensively against UMass, they would have had plenty of time to rest all of their guys throughout the course of that one. They played deeper into that game than they probably would have liked to. So I think the short week issue really has more to do with a preparation thing than anything. And it's just unfortunate that not only Georgia Tech has an extra day because they played on Thursday night. So unfortunate timing.
Definitely. Kirby talked a good bit about this Georgia Tech team, talked about Aaron Philo, the freshman from just down the road at Prince Avenue Christian, who started playing more and more, had a huge play in that win over NC State. He and Haynes King have been getting involved quite a bit between them. And Kirby mentioned Brent Key, former Yellow Jacket offensive lineman, who is now the head coach at Georgia Tech. Kirby was asked about him, sort of the job he's done building that Georgia Tech program. That's what Kirby had to say.
Stood out as he's doing it the good old-fashioned way, hard work, recruiting. They're in the same recruiting battles we are. They're going after the best players in the state, just like we are, and they're doing a better job on that front in terms of being able to recruit them. But they're still really physical. He coached with Nick. He coached with George O'Leary, who's one of the best there is at managing a program and being physical. So he knows what he's doing. He's got a great staff. He's hired a really good staff, and they got good football players.
I remember, guys, when it was a big deal that Jeff Collins hired Brent Key to come back to Georgia Tech, leaving Alabama. And I think Brent Key is the guy to make this rivalry interesting again. Now, the thing that's going to make this interesting is when eventually Georgia Tech beats Georgia again, which Georgia fans obviously don't want to hear. And I don't know that it's this year. But I do think that Brent's brought a spark back to this series. He's not been afraid to talk about how much he hates Georgia, which he played at Georgia Tech. I totally get that sentiment. But Ben, what do you think about the job Brent Key has done, especially when it comes to recruiting? I'm sure that Georgia Tech's probably popped up on your radar more covering Georgia recruiting than it has in years past.
there's no doubt that Georgia Tech's recruiting class this year has, one, put together guys from the state of Georgia that I personally think very highly of as football players, but also a couple of times where they were ruffling Georgia's feathers a little bit in some recruitments. And that's been a long time since that's happened. I personally love the energy that Brent Key brings to this rivalry. Like, not everybody embraces the hate. Kirby Smart certainly publicly does not do that, but I respect the way that Brent Key handles it. And I think that there's a reason why Kirby Smart handles it the way that he handles it in the rivalry. And there's a way that Brent Key does, because they're coming from completely different ends of the rivalry right now. But I think for Georgia Tech to get to where it wants to get, and for this roster to be able to be built and put together, and I think you have to take this approach of needling Georgia a little bit, and just you're not going to win every battle against Georgia. I think Georgia Tech's fully aware of that. But if you can win a couple here in recruiting, get some noise out there, give them a fight last year. Like, I think moral victories aren't a real thing, but I think the way that Georgia Tech played last year against Georgia had an impact on the trajectory of the program. I think the same thing could be said if you go into Sanford Stadium and make it a 4-quarter game and put up a fight. It says something about the trajectory of your football program. And so I think that there are some moral victories to take away from this, but I know that that's not the mission for this Georgia Tech team this year. Like, Brent Key is a very confident guy. I think that much is evident in the way that he talks about the way he runs his team and his football program. They are operating as if they're fully expecting to win this game. I think that they're a couple of years away probably from being able to put together a full roster the way that they need to do that consistently, especially in Athens. But it's hard to deny that they are, I don't want to say closing the gap, because Georgia's gap is just so much greater than everyone that it's unfair to Georgia Tech to say, like, hey, you're closing the gap. But I definitely think they are moving the right direction to making this rivalry a respectable and competitive one.
For sure. And yeah, talking about Brent Key's vibe, I mean, he's an offensive line coach, man. And I like hearing him after those games. I think about the win over Florida State and Ireland, him talking about, just running the ball and just, they took it to Florida State. Now, that win's lost a little bit of the shine with the season that Florida State's had, but I think he's doing a great job. He was seen by some as just sort of a bridge coach when he took over for Jeff Collins. And then there's talk, Willie Fritz might be getting this job. Okay, no, Willie Fritz is staying at Tulane. We'll just stay with Brent Key. He's done a great job. And 7-4 right now. I'm sure they would have liked a few more wins, but I think they're doing a really good job. Kipp, what do you think? What stands out to you about Brent Key and what he's done to this point at Georgia Tech?
I mean, he said he hated Georgia more than anything in the world last year. That's exactly the kind of coach Georgia Tech needs. I mean, again, Paul Johnson was flippant and had an offense that, set his program's NFL production back decades. But the man came in with an attitude and didn't care who was the coach at Georgia. It was competitive. Brent Key's coming in just for pure passion about it. And he might not, get the results he wants, but he said it. This is the most important game for the Georgia Tech program next week. And it might not be for Georgia, but again, a rivalry game, you want your rival to hate you and despise you regardless of the situation. And so I just think he's the perfect man for the job. They are actually recruiting really well and bringing in really good players. Just flipped a really good DB from Clemson, I believe. That's exactly what the program needs right now. And I do think, that's exactly what the rivalry needs. He is getting them up for this game and telling them, listen, there's not a team in this, in the country you should hate more than this team. They get all the pub, and I think it's great. It might not get them to wins, but it's definitely going to make this game more competitive than it would be if you bring in someone who just doesn't know what this rivalry means to both programs and why it's called clean old-fashioned hate. So perfect man for the job. Glad that they made that decision. And I think what they did against Miami the last couple of seasons, and what they did against Georgia last season. I mean, that was a close game. And not a lot of people talk about how close that game was. And if we're really thinking about it, Georgia Tech's better this year. Georgia hasn't played up to its standard this year. So if you think about it that way, there's a scenario where this game is even closer. My personal opinion, I don't think Georgia Tech's defense is able to stop anyone. So as long as Georgia is relatively healthy out there, they come out there and play to, the kind of football they've shown they're capable of playing when healthy. I don't think Georgia, they might not cover, but I think it should be a double-digit win for Georgia. But again, it's a much wider scenario where this is a 4-quarter game than what people might be expecting.
Kipp mentioned Georgia Tech flipping a DB from Clemson. That wasn't just any DB. That was former Georgia commit Tay Harris. So that's a pretty good get for Brent Key and company there. Wanted to talk a little bit about what some of the Georgia players had to say on Monday rather. Smile Munden and Dylan Fairchild both basically said they woke up and found out they were playing in the SEC championship game. That news happened so late. Smile Munden talked about playing in this rivalry as an in-state guy, said that, he, knows a lot of guys that are on the Georgia Tech side, played a lot of those guys in high school. So that kind of adds to this rivalry. Thought it was interesting. Dylan Fairchild said, hey, I grew up a big Georgia fan. I'm a big Georgia, my dad is a big Georgia fan, but my uncle is a big Georgia Tech fan. So it was kind of cool hearing him talk. I asked if there was going to be some Thanksgiving smack talk. It didn't sound like that's going to happen. I'd have to imagine the uncle probably doesn't want to mess with Dylan Fairchild at this point in Dylan's life. But it was interesting to sort of hear their perspective. I did want to play this clip of Dylan Fairchild talking about how these guys grind it out, especially as we're talking about Georgia's got the SEC title game now on its slate, and it's going to be playing a playoff caliber team. How does Georgia do this on a weekly basis? How do they continue fighting through injury, trying to get the job done every week? This is what Dylan had to say.
Last January.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of really two things. You got to take the action every day into going to the training room and taking care of yourself, and also knowing we have very limited opportunities. You're only really guaranteed 12 games a year. So taking advantage, knowing mentally this, any one of them could be the last one for us. It's football. We don't know when our last snap's going to be. So just knowing that, combining that knowledge with just the action of taking care of yourself, really can prepare you for a game. And during the game, this could be it. You don't know. So just knowing that and just doing the actions, taking the action to actually go take care of yourself as best you can, just combining those two things is probably the best way to do it.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, and those guys take their health seriously, and they have to if they're going to go out there and grind it out week after week. Well, guys, we will have on GoJackets.com's Garrett Chapman, 11 a.m. Eastern time on Wednesday, to really get into Georgia Tech, to really break down Brent Key and this Yellow Jackets team. But I did want to ask you guys just broadly, when you look at Georgia Tech, what do you want to see on Friday night? What needs to happen for Georgia? I'll start with you, Ben. What's sort of your focus going to be when it comes to this matchup, what you're going to be watching closely?
Well, it's probably the lazy answer because of what we saw last week, but I just want to see how this defense responds. I think that because of some of the things that Georgia Tech is able to do offensively, and they're probably going to throw multiple quarterbacks at you. They're going to have some good misdirection. Buster Faulkner is going to call up a pretty good one in this one, I would expect. I want to see how this Georgia defense responds. I think this is a game that will tell you a lot about who this Georgia team is heading into the SEC championship game. And, I've been talking for the last few weeks now, I'm kind of expecting this Georgia Tech game to be the, end of Georgia's regular season and what it would mean for how you're preparing for the playoff. Well, now this is an appetizer for a game that could get you a first round bye in that playoff that we weren't necessarily anticipating. And so it's an important game. This is I have some playoff protection now that you're in the SEC championship game, that if it goes sideways, you still have a path to be able to control your own destiny to get into the playoff. But this is a really important football game in terms of how Georgia responds from last week, and then how they, prepare and look ahead to the following.
Kipp, what about you? What are you going to be watching closely on Friday night?
Well, luckily for Georgia, the game isn't at 12:45, so they can't be accused of sleepwalking against the Yellow Jackets, which is exactly what they did against UMass. Again, they have to come out there and play focused football. The defensive front, you can't get away with, missing your assignments and not being focused in a game that means as much because, like I said, you don't need to put this in the hands of the committee. If Georgia goes 1-1 over the next 2 games, it should be a playoff lock. So you got to, win the next one. And again, they should be in. Lose the next one, you got to win in Atlanta. So that's my opinion on it. I think this is a chance for Georgia to lock up a spot in the playoffs. There should be no lack of motivation out there. And I do think that the offense, even though it's banged up, I think it's shown you found an offensive lineup you can work with. Monroe Freeling is playing outstanding football at left tackle right now. I think that's really kind of helped Carson Beck regain his confidence and play like the quarterback he looked like last season. And so I think the offense is going to have some success out there. The defense just has to buckle up and lock in. And guys like Jalen Walker and Chaz Chambliss, Michael Williams go out there and again, play assignment football. Don't get caught out there, just thinking about Atlanta because Georgia Tech's they're not UMass. They have talent. They have the chance to put some points on the board if you come out there and just kind of play like you did last weekend.
Yeah, and to that point, Georgia Tech's got a few guys that are quite familiar with Georgia. Buster Faulkner calling the plays. EJ Lightsey, who had a big pick 6 against NC State. Rylan Godey's been involved over the course of this season. And then on the Georgia side, you got Andrew Thacker as an analyst and then Josh Crawford as a running backs coach. So I think that kind of adds to it. Speaking of Crawford, for me, one of the areas I'm going to watch is just this run game. I think that they felt okay with riding Nate Frazier and getting those other freshmen involved against UMass, and they had done a pretty good job the week before with Tennessee. But again, we're watching to see, not expecting Trevor Etienne to play in this game. Kirby did give some good updates on Branson and Roderick Robinson. He said that they were expecting both of those guys to do more on Monday than they have. We'll see if they'll be available on Saturday, but just a very depleted running back room. You need to get those guys involved. Can't be all on Carson, although this Georgia Tech defense has not been very good. And sort of on that same note, one of the things Georgia Tech has been good at this year is third down defense. And it seems like Georgia's kind of been hit or miss. So let's see if Georgia can extend those drives, at least set up some third and shorts, third and manageables, and keep those drives alive. Well, Ben, another big recruiting weekend this past weekend for Georgia. A lot of folks in town for the UMass game. Tell us what we need to know out of that and any of the other developments. As we're sitting here talking, we got a little bit over a week until National Signing Day. That signing period in December officially gets underway.
Yeah, that's the crazy part about this is Georgia just hosted some guys about 8 days ago. They hosted more guys this past weekend. They're going to have more people on campus this upcoming weekend for the Georgia Tech game, at least. And with all that, National Signing Day is 4 days after the Georgia Tech game, or the signing period opens next Wednesday. So a lot of what's happening with Georgia recruiting right now behind the scenes is not even people necessarily that are coming on campus for some of these games. There's just a lot going on. So I'll start with the offense and then kind of move to the defense just in terms of what's happening and what moving parts are going on right now, because there really is a lot that's unfolding. I think the biggest thing I want to start with is the quarterback position. We've said for a while now, Georgia's trying to find that second quarterback, and they keep going down the line. I thought that at one point it was maybe going to be the Hawaiian quarterback, who I'm not going to do him the disservice of butchering his name one last final time. He's not coming on his official visit this upcoming weekend, and that pretty much etches in stone. He's either going to Oregon or Cal, and Georgia's really out of the running there. I thought at one point it could potentially be Kamario Taylor, who's committed to Mississippi State. His brother gets offered by Mississippi State. They do a savvy job of getting him back on campus, and it looks as though they're going to hold that one down. They've offered a couple of other guys, but the most recent offer was to Boise State commit Hezekiah Millender. The amazing part about him, I would say, is that he is in Georgia's backyard. He goes to Clark Central High School. I mean, I went over there today, and it's 5 minutes from my house to go see him. I mean, it is right in Georgia's backyard. I think I did the Google Maps. It's a 23-minute walk from Buttsmere to the Clark Central football field. So if Kirby Smart and Mike Bobo wanted to, during the year, if they wanted to have made just a little afternoon stroll, they could have made it real easy. But the funny thing about it is I think that this was something that he camped with Georgia in the summer or in the spring. I'm not 100% sure on the timeline. And he, threw for Mike Bobo, as many quarterbacks have, and they maintained that relationship. But it really wasn't until after his senior year ended. He ended up, and I got some stats wrong in one of my notebooks that I put in earlier, so I wanted to correct the record here, and I have in a subsequent article as well. He threw for 25 touchdowns, rushed for another 12 touchdowns, and only had one interception this season. That excludes his last game of the year against Houston County. They lost that game 69-48, which I want to see the film on that one because I imagine that was probably a ridiculous game to watch. But I haven't talked with him about that today. He was like, yeah, I did some stupid stuff in that one. So I think he might have had a pick or two in that game that might have inflated some of the turnover stats. And he was the one that told me about that. So you can sense the humility from him there. He gets that offer last night after having visited over the weekend. Georgia really wants this second quarterback, and so it's hard not to view him as the clear front-running option right now. Having just been over there earlier today and talking with him, like, he is saying all the right things as it pertains to his Boise State commitment, and I totally respect that. The Georgia offer is so fresh, and he's had this long-standing relationship with Boise State for such an extended period of time. I'm sure that he wants to have some conversations with them and with Georgia before he does anything, so I don't, right now he's saying he's locked into Boise State. It's hard to think that a Georgia offer this late in the process. I mean, again, this is a guy who moved from Arizona to Georgia to play in high classification football because he wanted to increase the exposure. He's a very confident guy. You talk to some of his coaches and trainers and the people that work with him. I mean, he has a very capable deep ball. I know that he's going to get the dual threat tag, and I think that it's a fair tag if you're using it the right way. Like, I don't think that this is a guy that you're expecting to go, chunk off 70-yard touchdown runs, but I think that he moves the pocket in a way. I mean, he talked about it with me today. Like, he thinks his strength is his ability to manipulate the pocket and make throws down the field. That's when I watch his film where I see him shining as well. He has a very accurate deep ball. He's very confident, composed when he's throwing the football. He's a point guard, naturally playing basketball. He was very humble today, right up until I started talking to him about his basketball game. And that's when he said, oh, I'm a for real hooper now. So but you can see that it flashes when you watch his film. He's a guy that distributes the ball like a point guard. I think that you see that show up, and he's someone that makes a lot of sense for me as Georgia's second quarterback if that ends up happening. If he does not end up flipping from Boise State to Georgia by signing day, your guess is as good as mine as to who the second quarterback is going to be in this class, or if there's going to end up being a second quarterback in this class at all. I think Georgia is going to get some good news on the offensive line this week at some point. So stay locked into Dawgs 24/7, subscribe. I think that there is going to be some positive momentum there for Stacey Searle's group. If you've been following along closely, you probably can get a solid idea of where things are going there. Something that happened on the offensive side that has nothing to do with a Georgia visit this past weekend, Georgia running back commit Usmani Kroma, he takes a visit to Auburn, and anybody that was in that Auburn environment, I'm sure, had a blast. It looked like an electric night, Jordan. We've been in plenty of night games at Jordan-Hare. We know how crazy it can get. That looked like about as fun of one as you're going to find. I'm sure he had a great time. I know that he stayed overnight with his family and coaches and spent some extra time over there. Our Auburn undercover site, Christian Clemente, he had some good stuff talking with him after that visit, and Christian was nice enough to share some of that audio with me as well, just so I could sort of get a sense of where things were going. I think there is some genuine Auburn interest here. I think that Auburn is supremely confident in their chances to be able to flip Usmani Kroma. I think that Georgia still thinks that it has a really good chance to be able to hold on to him. This is, these new age college football recruitments. I don't even want to say new age, like it's totally different than it used to be, but you're able to be a little bit more forthcoming about some of this stuff. It's the last week and a half before signing day. You've got a couple of suitors, anybody that's ever been in sales, you're trying to, do your last minute negotiations. If you don't have some other school that is interested in you, that also is trying to, maybe give you a little bit for your services, then, you don't have as much negotiation power. So I think that's going on all over the country, sometimes more publicly than others, just because of visits that get taken when in some cases visits aren't being taken. And so you don't have as many of those conversations being had in headlines. I'm not even ready to make a call one way or the other on Ousmane Kromah, but I'll just say from, the sourcing that I trusted with him coming to Georgia in the first place, I think that I trust that he will probably hold on to his Georgia commitment, but I think that it's an uncomfortable position to be in to say confidently that I think he's going to hold on to his Georgia commitment at this point. I know I've just talked to you for like 10 minutes, but we got a whole defensive side of the ball to talk about. Was there anything that I missed there, Kip?
I mean, you kind of summed it up. I think most of, the offensive side of the ball, you've kind of given everyone the lay of the land. At this point, it's just about flipping defensive linemen and linebackers, maybe a 5-star cornerback commit here or there if they can land one. But it's other than that, it's really just flip city with I guess a little bit over a week to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at a guy that was on his official visit this past weekend, Florida commit Jeremiah McLeod, which I think you have to talk about Jeremiah McLeod when you talk about Ousmane Kromah. I've had many a conversation with both of them in the past about them growing up together and wanting to play football together at the next level. And, I've been thinking for a while, because Ousmane Kromah has been committed to Georgia, that Jeremiah McLeod was close to a shoe-in to end up in Georgia's class eventually as well. I think, I still feel very strongly about Jeremiah McLeod ending up in this Georgia class, especially coming out of this official visit weekend. And I would probably feel more confidently about Ousmane Kromah sticking should that news happen in the near future, just because those two are very close. They have a good friendship with Isaiah Gibson as well. And Isaiah Gibson and Jeremiah McLeod were spending a lot of time together this past weekend when they were on their visits too. So I think that that's one that you're looking at. I think when you look at the linebackers, I can't say for certain that Georgia's going to take a third linebacker, but if Tavion Wallace or Arkansas commit Tavion Wallace or Tennessee commit Christian Gass called Georgia between now and signing day and said, hey, I've reconsidered and I actually want to come to Georgia, Georgia would find a way for either of those two prospects. I firmly believe that. And then as Kip mentioned, I think that when you look at the 5 stars, everyone's going to be looking at Justice Terry, the 5-star defensive lineman. They're going to be looking at the 5-star cornerback, DJ Pickett. I feel Justice Terry was at Auburn this past weekend as well on an official visit. Cannot be ignored. I have to acknowledge everything that I just said about Ousmane Kromah. There is some positive vibes coming out of Auburn this past weekend as well. I would be very surprised if Justice Terry landed anywhere other than Georgia. I went to his game on Friday night. Trey Scott was there. I will say Texas defensive line coach Chris Gilbert was also there. So Texas and Auburn are two schools that feel like they still have an outside shot, but I like Georgia to get Justice Terry and have all 5 of the in-state 5 stars sign with the Bulldogs, which would be pretty remarkable stuff. DJ Pickett, I don't have the best pulse on right now in terms of whether I think he's going to stick with LSU, flip to Oregon, LSU, or Georgia. There is much more positive momentum on the Georgia side than I would have expected. The one thing that I will say with all of this, we talk about Georgia right now, they're at 26 commitments. I've just, talked about Hezekiah Millender. We've talked about Dennis Uzochukwu. We've talked about Jeremiah McLeod, Justice Terry, one of the linebackers, DJ Pickett. Like, numbers start getting tight. There's certain guys that they will say you're a take and we have a spot for you no matter what, no matter when, and that will happen. There are some people that maybe that is not the case with, but at a certain point, I've heard, I'll give a tip of the cap to our old friend, my predecessor, Rusty Manziel. He always like to say big boy decisions. This is that time of year. I think that you have to start making some of those depending on who says, yes, we want in, and, who, maybe is at spots or position groups that you have a lot of depth. I mean, you have to start having some uncomfortable conversations with people, and that's just the nature of the business. But I think this is that time of year where you might start hearing some weird things come out that you might not have been expecting.
Kipp, as we mentioned, we got a little over a week to go. What are you most intrigued by for what's coming up? I mean, what are you going to be watching closely when it comes to Georgia's signing class?
Overall, just how they approach the numbers. Kirby's always, he's managed the numbers as well as any coach can. And, we spent the longest time wondering whether they were going to work with an 85 roster or a 105 roster. Now we kind of know it's going to be, that 85 is what they're working with. So for me, I'm looking at it and going, okay, they have 26 guys right now. I think in the end, they end up with a sub 30 number. Let's just say 29. But we've also, again, had in previous classes guys that are, forward counters. There's a couple of guys that go on scholarship in year 2. So the number might not match exactly what we think it is when all is said and done. We just feel pretty confident that as far as first-year scholarship players, I think, 28 to 20, probably 29 is a number. It just might look like, it might look like 30, it might look like even 31. I'm not going to, leave that out as a possibility. And does this commitment list look the same as well? You mentioned, other schools are recruiting Georgia's class. Of course they are. They have the number 1 class in the country. You don't get that class with other schools trying to flip your guys. But I do think there's going to be just some sort of change in this commitment list between, now and signing day. And I'm not just talking about additions. I just think there'll be movement. There usually is in the last couple of days. And it's just, with this being that cycle that we're going into, the collective bargaining, we're going into not signing national letters of intent. How do the programs handle this? Are we going to be the ones that are announcing where these guys are going and then waiting until they enroll? Or are the schools going to announce anyone? Do you feel confident in, your guys enrolling at Georgia when they're only signing non-binding financial aid paperwork in this cycle? Next cycle, I think they'll make a new NLI that's tied into collective bargaining, and it'll be somewhat, back to the way it was before. This in-between cycle, I don't know. We could have a situation where no one's announced, and then even after signing day, these guys just still flip and enroll in other programs. Like, is this even signing day? That's still something. I just think there's going to be some additional drama this cycle. Maybe not for Georgia, but definitely nationally, where guys sign the paperwork that doesn't bind them to the program, show up at other campuses. Who knows? Show up at multiple campuses, but technically once you get there, that's when your eligibility is supposed to start. So I do think we're going to have a lot of, people looking through that student, to see if you could see the different people and the student searches on different rosters, finding out that guys are actually in multiple student searches, and then, seeing them in class, and that being how we confirm some of these guys are actually part of the program.
Yeah, we're gonna try to get a bunch of interns in different majors. Ben, were you gonna throw something in there?
One name I wanted to throw in as a guy that I think we should still consider a possibility for Georgia would be Florida State defensive line commit Kevin Wynn. It's not someone that I'm predicting or putting in the class, but I do think he'll be on a visit to Georgia this weekend on Friday. And so I just can't totally rule that out given the position that he plays and how much Georgia likes to build depth there.
Ben did a great job breaking down the recruiting situation. He does it every day on Dawgs 24/7. Highly encourage you guys to subscribe there. Stay woke with the Georgia recruiting. He does a fantastic job on that front. Well, Georgia men's basketball minute before we get out of here. A huge win for Georgia down in the Bahamas. They lost on Saturday 80-69 to number 15 Marquette, but bounced back on Sunday, beating number 22 St. John 66-63. Wasn't the prettiest game from Georgia, 24 turnovers, 10 by Silas Demery Jr., but Silas came up clutch in the final minutes, had some big buckets, had some big free throws, and Georgia found a way to win despite Asa Newell fouling out, Blue Kane fouling out, RJ Godfrey fouling out, and Silas comes up with a steal on St. John's final possession to secure the win. Georgia's first win over a top 25 team since January of 2023, when they beat Auburn in Mike White's first SEC game at Georgia. First top 25 win against a non-conference opponent since December 2021. If you remember when Ant Edwards and the Bulldogs beat up on Memphis, a big win there. So huge win for Georgia, 6-1. I thought it was huge to get a victory down in the Bahamas, knowing that was going to be very hard to do. But they've got some momentum. They got to take care of business against Jacksonville on Saturday night. That's a Jacksonville team that just beat Virginia Tech by 10. But fellas, I think the vibes are pretty good around Georgia men's basketball right now.
Huge win. Huge win. I mean, those are the types of wins you got to have. And you don't know exactly what that win's going to look like necessarily at the end of the year. But I mean, as of right now, it's a quad 1 win, right?
I believe it is. Kip, What do you think?
So those are the types of wins you got to have.
Win, and they got votes. I mean, they got top 25 votes. That puts them, what were you saying, like 37th? Yeah. I mean, you want this team to maintain that trajectory. You got a couple big games coming up. I mean, you got to take care of business against Jacksonville, which we said. I mean, they're a team you can't go in there and just expect to win that game. It's a game where it'd be great if you could start getting these guys hot from 3-point percentage. I mean, that's really the key. Start getting some of these shots falling going into what should be a fairly competitive Notre Dame game. I think that's another, like, they're not where they were before, but it's still a top 100 program as of now. So you're still, looking at multiple, quad 2, quad 3 scenarios there to where, I mean, those are resume builders going into conference play, and they're also confidence builders because you still have a lot of young players on this team. And we kind of saw that late in the, conference play last year. That freshman class didn't really have the confidence that they could win those games when they were coming down the stretch, and you just kind of saw it get away from them multiple times. These are the games where you just build that up to where, okay, we just beat a legit tournament team and take care of business these teams and prove that we belong, not at the back end of the SEC, but as a conference a tournament team in this conference under Mike White. I just think that, again, one of the biggest wins of the last couple of years and something that you can really build some momentum going into conference play.
I want to see a little bit better guard play. I feel like too many turnovers, not hitting enough threes, but I feel like those are correctable things. And I was like, the turnover thing, obviously back-to-back tough games for Silas Demery. I think you trust him to not make mistakes and to correct those types of things. I think it was just tough go of things back-to-back games for him from a turnover standpoint.
Yeah, Rick Pitino especially loves to get after teams. So to be able to beat them was huge. Silas came up clutch late. Tyron Lawrence, Dylan James, who had to play a lot of minutes late because of the foul situation. And as Kip mentioned, big win. And I think it's just huge in November to have that early, really nice piece of your resume. Doesn't guarantee anything. I mentioned that win over Memphis, their last non-conference win. That was actually the year after Anthony Edwards. That team only won 6 games. So this doesn't guarantee you a single thing. But, it's nice to have this. I think it showed you the caliber of this team and what they are capable of doing. Well, we're going to wrap it up right there. I'm going to go ahead and plug again, 11 a.m. On Wednesday. We will have on Garrett Chapman from GoJackets.com. He's going to help us preview Georgia Tech, another edition of Clean Old-Fashioned Hate. I want to shout out all the folks in the comments. We got Wayne, we got Tree Cracker, Silvertooth, David Williams, Thomas T-Bone, David Bloodworth, Patrick Garnella, Primetime Dog, John Richards. Thank you all for watching this live. I'm going to get in the habit of calling out everyone who watches this live because we appreciate it. Thanks if you're watching it live. You're watching or listening to it after the fact, we appreciate y'all's support. Subscribe to the Junkyard Dawgcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Be sure to leave your feedback, give us 5 stars, let us know what you think of the pod. Go to Dawgs 24/7 If you're listening to this on Monday, keep an eye out. Pretty sure we're going to have a sale coming up here shortly to get ready for the holidays. And, you want to be sitting around the Thanksgiving table and seeing what's going on with recruiting. Maybe read a clean old-fashioned hate preview before you cut into the turkey and get ready for a big day with family. Go to our YouTube, go to our TikTok, subscribe there. We're going to have a ton of good content on football as well as men's basketball. So we'll wrap it up right there. For Kipp Adams and Ben Wolk, I'm Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.